Um, welcome to this virtual launch of the publication, Serving Justice in a Time of Global Crisis, Having Inconvenient Conversations. Today is World Day for International Justice, and we welcome our panelists who are contributing authors to the book. My co-editor, Stan Henkeman from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and of course, you, the audience. We are glad that you've been able to join us today. As we were talking earlier, we said there are so many online events happening at the moment, and we are just pleased that people can take the time to join our particular launch today. It's not a webinar in the conventional sense, but a launch of our publication, providing the authors with an opportunity to briefly speak to their contributions to this publication. The publication, as indicated, is being launched on World Day for International Justice amidst an unprecedented public health crisis, which is worsening and which has highlighted the political, economic, ecological fault lines globally, and virtually every connected system, food, health, education, and so on. So today we focus on justice, which underpins all of the above. And we look at the inconvenient conversations that we need to be having to move forward. All the authors have made contributions which possibly can be quite uncomfortable to many, are inconvenient, but are very relevant to the times that we are living in. The 10 contributions from the publication, are from contributing authors and organizations who are deeply concerned with justice, the levels of inequality in the world, and the desire for a different world in which crass materialism and greed are not the order of the day. Each of the contributors will speak briefly to their piece, and we will place the publication in the Zoom chat and on Facebook Live as we close off the webinar today, the launch today. I first welcome all of you and call on Shanolo Shawadi, the CEO of Community Advice Officers South Africa, and her piece is titled, Justice is Nourishment for Development. It must begin in communities. Shanolo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zanaria, and to the organizers for today's event. I think it's a beginning of a time and a season where we recognize justice for the value that it's in. So my piece was actually inspired by conversations that were taking place from the community advice offices. The national structure has provincial structures, and the advice offices, as this pandemic was ravaging through communities and as the lockdown was being implemented, was a desperate search for food parcels. And as they were asking each other, and they were asking me, and we were asking our partners, where are the food parcels? It brought about a question of, this is how people experience justice in this country. They search for it. They consistently search for it. And in some instances, they can't find it. And so the piece is inspired by those conversations that the Community Advice Office paralegals were actually engaging in. And a wonderful opportunity to contribute to this publication. And I think it is important that this pandemic leaves us changed. It leaves us with a sense of what is development and why is justice such a key part of development. So in the piece, I've basically created an analogy where I say that justice is like nourishment. For anybody to be nourished, they have to be fed. For development to take place, there has to be an element of investment in nourishment. And so the piece is basically looking at that, where interesting conversations around how people in our communities have had to access food parcels by wearing political party t-shirts, had to be in government offices and presenting their membership cards for political parties, which is so absurd. But it's an important time, and it shows us where the country is. And it was just a wonderful opportunity for us as the sector, as the community-based advice officers, to just highlight what our experiences are and how we view these experiences in the broader framework of what is necessary and why justice is a worthy investment that needs to be made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shanolo, for your contribution, and I'm sure people will be engaging with the publication and your piece. Thank you. And now call on Rede August and Craig Stewart, respectively from the Warehouse Trust. Rene is a member of the strategic leadership team and Craig is the CEO. And their piece is Inconvenient for Whom. They can decide who goes first. Because they are co-authors of this piece, I've asked both of them to speak to the piece and give their points of view. Please join us now and speak about your piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Zenaria. Good morning, everybody. My name is Rene August. I don't look like Craig, but my colleague Craig will speak after me. We decided to co-author this because of the nature of the question that you asked us. And in our experience as an organization, the Warehouse, who works predominantly with Christian churches and church leaders to help churches seek the justice of God in community, and what does peace look like within that conversation. And so in the wake of lockdown, and as people were struggling to find food, and issues of food security and unemployment, and this compounding systemic intersectional injustice was weighing very obviously on a certain sector of our community, we noticed that the questions and the conversations that people were wanting to have had everything to do with power. And so our piece really is trying to frame this conversation, and even this topic about inconvenient conversations around this issue of power. And we ended up asking, inconvenient for whom? Because it is very convenient for me to speak about certain things, while at the same time it leaves a space of inconvenience for another. And so as we thought about this, we kind of landed on this place of saying it's not only about conversations that are convenient and inconvenient, but for us, the deeper question is, how do we nurture communities where just conversations can happen? This resilience that we build within communities and within organizations to have conversations about justice and the nature of injustice is not just about a once-off conversation. We need to be able to return to those conversations, and especially where promises are broken, as we engage with power, that obviously happens, to be able to have the capacity and the trust and the grace and the wisdom within those to return to some things that feel inconvenient, and shift the locus of power. And so, yeah, that was really the thrust of what we're wanting to say, because the issues aren't just about food. The issue is not only this pandemic. This pandemic is giving us a moment to wake us up to the realities of what's happening, the injustice that's always been there, the violence of poverty, of discrimination, of exclusion. And so at that juncture, I want to hand over to Craig, my colleague, and he will speak about the second part of our piece.
Thanks, Renee, and thank you, Zenaria, for the opportunity to participate in this. The word apocalypse is often used in relationship to religious people, and in our common usage of it, we tend to view it as something that's an ending or a dramatic destruction. But its root word in the scriptures and in Greek is, rather than an apocalypse, is an unveiling, an uncovering. And so in the Christian scriptures, the big apocalyptic book is the book of Revelation. It's a moment that reveals. And so for us, one of the parts of our conversation is inconvenient conversations are conversations that are apocalyptic for those who are used to holding power, who are used to framing the conversation, who are used to having the conversation about them. That if these conversations we're wanting to have are truly going to be justice generating, they need to do the work of unveiling justice. They need to be apocalyptic in that they unveil injustice and reveal the opportunity for justice going further. That they can't just be discussions that entertain and titillate. They must happen in a context that challenges and disrupts. They need to be mutual and critical to generate shared understanding, to generate meaning, and to generate creative action. And I think particularly for those of us who are those for whom the system has worked, that in this time and season, the system has worked for me on an ongoing basis. The sort of generations that have come before me have created privilege for me, that they inconvenient conversation needs to be apocalyptic for me and for people like me who carry that privilege. That in a sense, like the emperor who had no clothes, that an inconvenient conversation needs to create the moments where I feel unveiled, where I feel naked. And that we must build in those community Renee talks about, we must build resilience to live with those moments of unveiling, to live with those moments where we realize that the very clothing, jewelry, and shoes that we have are the scaffolding of injustice, and that they work against the fruit we are seeking. And we need to build resilience in our inconvenient conversations to work towards that end, where true justice can be unveiled and generated, and injustice is made visible and made clear to all. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Renee and Craig, for your input. And I will now go straight to Ignatius France, who is the training coordinator at the Justice Desk. And his piece is titled, New Normal Requires New Justice. Ignatius, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Zenaria. Greetings to all, the panelists and the broader justice family coming in from your homes and offices. Firstly, I think I want to thank Community Chest for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation about justice. And in kind of sort of preparation for this, I recently came across a performance by the rapper Common. I don't know, some of you might know who that is, featuring Yolanda Adams, and the performance was for the Obama administration. It was one of the last kind of send-offs. But the point of my story is that in the song, there's a line that says, justice for all is not specific enough. And this kind of had me thinking about the different approaches or the different critics that when they talk about movements like Black Lives Matter, trying to make it as vague and inclusive. When we talk about issues like gender-based violence, where again, the approach has been to try and make it as inclusive as possible. So broadly speaking, the conversations around justice are formulated in such a way that they are not specific enough. Sorry, I'm reading from my notes here. Yeah, so they're not specific enough. And in our quest for justice, we must then get very specific. We must not shy away from calling a spade, rather than, as they say, a cultural instrument. And so too, in this new normal, we have to be specific about what it is we want and what it is that we need. Our vagueness has not delivered results in the past for the people that are in need of assistance. So we must become more specific in our approach to justice. And the idea really is that we must hold accountable the leaders and demand a higher level of efficiency. I think both Tsinolo and Craig and Renee's piece speak a little to that. But there's also this concept that Archbishop Emeritus Tutu coined when he spoke about a critical partnership. And this type of partnership really is where we understand that all social partners are needed, but by no means does this mean that it's a co-option of those social partners. You don't, when you are part of the conversation, doesn't mean that you leave your kind of your stance on things and what you bring to the table. But in this space or partnership, we must have the ability to be critical of each other, and to do so allows for the old systems of or rather not to do so, not to be critical, allows for the old systems of injustice to prevail. So what that means is that being critical does not mean we are enemies. It just means that we point out our mistakes, learn from them, and learn to do better, especially for the people that we serve. And then just in closing, the crisis we find ourselves in today requires a new type of thinking and a new strategy and new justice. And I want to reference a Bible verse, and I apologize to Rene, who's a trained theologian, if I butcher this verse, but it talks about, it's in Matthew 9, verse 19, where it talks about old wine and new skins, and really this idea that the two, it's a terrible idea to pour new wine into old skins, because the new wine will damage, or rather the old skins will burst. In the same way, we cannot think about the old way of conducting business, of conducting community development, or even church. The old way will not work. We have to reimagine a new way. We have to adjust our expectations and create new systems to meet these new conditions. So the new normal requires that new justice. And so I think that's in essence what my piece was trying to point to, that the old way of doing things wasn't working. The new way, as we call it now, the new normal, has to rethink the way in which we approach justice. Thank you, Zenaria.
Thank you very much, Ignatius, for your input. Our next author will be Lynette Mart, who is the National Director of the Black Sash, who has been making a lot of noise around the basic income grant. And I see in the news recently, there's been more reflection about that in terms of government. Her piece is entitled Basic Income Support is Crucial for Social and Economic Justice. Lynette, your 3 minutes.
Thank you, Zenaria, and thank you to the Community Chess for this wonderful opportunity of engaging in this debate. Our focus in this article has been just tying into Zanolo's piece around the issue of people struggling to find food. We have found over the many years that whilst our government has concentrated on the first generation rights, for example, the right to vote, etc., that the socio-economic rights, in a sense, have been left behind. And there's been a continuous struggle to put that item on the agenda. Just a few figures. Just before we went into COVID, 10.4 million people were unemployed. And many of those unemployed people, because of structural unemployment, will not find a job. The South African Reserve Bank has noted that the economy in this year will shrink by 7.2%. And already we saw in the week a study being released that about 3 million people have lost their jobs through the pandemic. And 2 million of those people are actually women who have lost their jobs. And so if one look at that picture, and I mean, we're making use of Zoom, etc., but the fourth industrial revolution are taking a lot of those jobs that we will not quite recover, and there isn't alternative strategies for how jobs are going to be created. We had a seminar where we said that we need to look at all of this in a world. We have a concept of work, and we have a concept of what work ought to be, but that is changing fundamentally, and we need to think through a world where we won't have full employment. And South Africa's unemployment figures have been high for many, many years. So the South African Constitution makes provision for the right in Section 27 for the right to social security and appropriate social assistance if citizens are unable to support themselves. Now, whilst we have 18 million people in some form of income support, there is a large percentage of people, particularly those between the ages of 18 to 59, able-bodied people, but due to structural unemployment, that are unable to find jobs. And they are not being made provision for in the programming of the Department of Social Development and of SASSA. The Black Sash have campaigned tirelessly for this right. And we were part of a coalition in 2015 to secure that South Africa becomes or sign the United Nations International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And since then, the committee has released a report in 2017. It made the recommendations that the state must ensure that those between 18 to 59 with little or no income have access to social assistance. And the deadline for that commitment to be undertaken is the 31st of October, 2020. So we're close to that deadline. It's also said that the South African government needs to consider the introduction of a universal basic income grant. And all of this is actually a matter of socioeconomic justice. So whilst we think that the idea and the introduction of the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant is innovative, we think that the state needs to go beyond that it needs to put in place a permanent mechanism for social assistance to the category of 18 to 59. And that the current value of 350 Rand is highly insufficient, and it needs to move towards the level of the upper poverty bound level of 1,227 Rand. And I think that the challenge for us is South Africa cannot afford not to provide this income, given the fact that millions of people are now economically desperate. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette, and we hope that that call gains ground, given the situation currently under COVID-19, which your piece in the publication makes very clear. I now call on Gugu Nonjinge, who is the Afrobarometer Communications Coordinator for Southern Africa at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And her piece focuses on ecological or climate justice, and it's titled Integrating Climate Justice in Social Justice Conversations. Gugu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Afternoon, everyone. I nearly said good morning, then I remembered it's 12:30. I chose the piece that I wrote mainly because currently, and even problematically so, climate change and especially climate justice is not ranked as a priority, nor is it even universally understood as a threat to the liberation of vulnerable groups, especially to vulnerable communities, which are communities that we work in, not just in IGR, but a number of organizations that are in this chat today. Surprisingly, one thing that I came across, or rather one thing that also pressed me to write this piece, is that Africa, and not just South Africa alone, is responsible for a really small percentage of the global carbon dioxide emissions that contribute to climate change globally, and yet we are the most affected by the impacts of climate change. Even research has also shown that the rural minorities, or even the majorities of the communities that we work in, will suffer the most from climate change because of droughts, because of floods, and the most sad part is that they can't can't buy their way out of these problems. Our Afrobarometer data that was collected across 34 African countries has shown that 49% of ordinary Africans say that climate change conditions for agricultural purposes or even production has become worse over the past decades. Even a significant proportion of those people across the continent, close to 67% of them, has also said that climate change is making life worse for them in Africa. So I think in us recognizing the role for international justice, we should not eliminate climate justice because it also impacts the communities that we work in. And I also hope that this day should also be a reminder for us to recognize, practice, and even continue to advocate for intersectional environmentalism, because it is inclusive. It not only advocates for the environment, but also it advocates for the protection of the people and the planet. Moreover, again, intersectional environmentalism identifies the ways in which injustices happen to marginalized communities and the earth, and also proves that they are interconnected. One thing that I wanted to take out from what I wrote in this article is that, like the rest of the world, as we continue in Africa and in South Africa to battle with the coronavirus pandemic, one thing that we need to underscore, rather the most important realization right now, is that the COVID-19 pandemic is not a separate issue from the environmental crisis that we're currently going into, or rather going through. In fact, COVID-19 is just one manifestation of the emergency that is currently going on as a direct result of how we mismanage and how we are exploiting the natural world. So both COVID-19 and climate change underscore the fundamental concept about justice that frontline communities have known and felt so long. So it is important for us to center and integrate climate justice in the social justice conversations going forward.
Thank you, Google. And you're quite spot on in relation to the issues of ecological climate justice, which there's been chat about that or movements around that for many, many years, but suddenly with COVID, the focus is how the breakdown in the ecology has been part of the contributing factors to a pandemic such as COVID-19. So thank you for that. I now call on Dominique Dreiding, who is also at IJR, and she is the Afrobarometer project leader in the research and policy program. And Dominique's piece is the culture of racism in private schools in Cape Town. So it's quite hyper-local, but it's an issue which has grabbed her attention. Please, Dominique, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zanaria, and all the organizers, and good afternoon to everybody. As mentioned, my piece focuses on the culture of racism in private schools in Cape Town. It centers on the Blackout Tuesday hashtag, which trended shortly after the murder of George Floyd, in which Instagram users posted a black square in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the institutions which did this was a private school in Cape Town. And shortly after posting this, past and present pupils took to the comment section to highlight the hypocritical nature of the post and cited various experiences of racism and microaggressions that they'd experienced while attending that particular school. One of the comments that really stood out to me, and which I quoted in my piece, was from a past pupil who said, "This school broke my spirit. I went in confident, happy, and optimistic. I left feeling broken, beaten, unworthy, hating the world, lost, hopeless, and angry. The school made me hate being a person of color. We deserve more than a black square. You can't change our experience of your school as past students, but you can change the way in which future students of color will experience your school." And I think this perfectly encapsulates the injustice and discrimination experienced by people of color in the private schooling environment. While these institutions shout about matric results, they don't shout about remedying pupils' experiences of racism and injustice. Shifting these established narratives in school cultures might not be easy, but it is necessary. In addition to school leadership making anti-racism and ultimately justice for all a priority, every conversation and classroom engagement should be seen as an opportunity to serve this greater vision. by normalizing the uncomfortable conversations about race, about privilege, discrimination, students from all races and socioeconomic backgrounds will better understand their role of not only upholding, but also dismantling the system by being able to listen and engage with people from different lived experiences or points of view. So schools provide an opportunity to nurture future generations of citizens who value justice and the ideals of a just society. And having these uncomfortable conversations will ensure that not only private schools and schools in general in the long run are on the right side of history, but also more positively contribute to the ideals, the democratic ideals and the justice ideals of South Africa and the new South Africa particularly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. And this issue of racial justice is in fact echoed in a number of pieces in the publication as part of a look at comprehensive justice. So I'm going to call on Sharon Ikambaram, who is the head of the Refugee and Migrant Rights Program at Lawyers for Human Rights, and her piece is entitled Questioning the Assumed Criminality of Blackness. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, Zenaria, and thanks for organizing this event, for inviting us to write to the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation as well. I think it comes at a very, very important point in our history, in the crisis, the health crisis that COVID is presenting to us. I want to take the advantage of, you offered us options of what to do. I have a quote that I want to read out. And I want to just speak to two sections or comments that I read in the publication, which I think is very relevant and powerful for what we're trying to do with this at a very critical moment in our history. I think the points that were made in the opening statement by you and Stanley Zenaria sum up for me what the challenges going forward. And I think, you see there is the key in our contributions is a dissatisfaction with the status quo and the quest for an alternative. And I think I want to underscore that because I think there's just 1 second of reflection that so-called civil society needs to take a deep introspection into how we go forward and how are we building solidarity and where's our agency in mobilizing to address the crisis that is facing us and facing humanity. And it's all our articles are a call for a compelling vision for a different kind of society. And then I think that we can't underscore the importance of the point that Gugu is raising in this, the question of climate justice. And I want to add just 1 point, Gugu, on without racial justice, but also the point of gender equality. I think we are seeing, the statistics that Zenaria raised initially, the massive bloodbath of women with unemployment. And we're not understanding, our statistics are so bad. We're not disaggregating what is happening in the informal economy. What kind of work is being created there and who's carrying the burden of that in alleviating poverty. So I think those are the 2 key points, but I'm going to end my very short brief to speak to my article, which is a scourge on society, a xenophobia. And it's a sad, sad day that South Africa has to carry this burden of the kind of xenophobia that we're experiencing in our communities and being fueled by leadership, reckless leadership, making shocking statements that are xenophobic, scapegoating, a phenomenon which has been in part of humanity for its entire existence as phenomenon of migration. And I want to close by reading a statement that the late Arthur Chaskelson, the first Chief Justice of our Constitutional Court, he delivered the 3rd Brown-Fisher lecture way back in 18th of May 2000. That's 20 years ago. And at that time, it was only 6 years into our democracy. And I think it's a very important point that he's raising, which I think has incredible relevance and is it's a terrible indictment on us, actually, that 20 years later, we are still making the same, we could be still making the very same rallying call. And excuse me for reading it out. He says, the Constitution offers a vision of the future, a society in which there will be social justice and respect for human rights, a society in which the basic needs of all people will be met, in which we live together in harmony, showing respect and concern for one another. We are capable of realizing this vision, but in danger of not doing so. This was way back in 2000. We seem temporarily to have lost our way. Too many of us are concerned about what we can get from the new society, something of the consumerism that Kumi speaks about in his article. Sorry, I've lost my point. What is lacking, and this is the important point that I really want to make emphasis on, which is very relevant for this conversation and what we do going forward. What is lacking is the energy, the commitment, and the sense of community that was harnessed in the struggle for freedom in our country. And I think that it is a terrible indictment of the othering that we are witnessing. And that's the essence of what my article speaks to in terms of xenophobia and the inequalities and how we're turning against each other instead of building solidarity to eradicate these inequalities in our quest for a society free of capitalism and the kind of inequalities we're experiencing. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for a very eloquent piece and your emphasis on that other invisible pandemic, xenophobia. And we hope that we will be using the opportunity that COVID has presented us with to look at all these uncomfortable, unsettling issues without which there will be no justice. I now call on Marcel, who is the chairperson of the Sediba Global Partnership Office, and her piece is titled Justice and the Rona. How do we manifest justice in a global pandemic? Marcel, I know you're joining us from New York and it's very early in the morning, so thank you very much for getting up and joining us.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon. It is 6:37 a.m. in New York City and 36 degrees Celsius outside. As you can see, I'm in a sundress and I'm watching you all in your winter clothes as you're sitting in South Africa. Thank you so much, Scenaria and Stan, for having me be a part of this really fabulous group of folk to both write the publication and then to be able to engage with the pieces as they present themselves. My piece was really inspired by two things happening concurrently. My husband is an ICU nurse in Harlem Hospital, and George Floyd's death and all the Black lives that have been taken from us in really unfair and unkind and violent ways through police brutality, etc., in the US. So having been born and raised in apartheid South Africa and just being a girl from Macassar in the Western Cape, it's really hard. I've lived in the US for the past 15 years, and really what Sharon just said just stuck with me, and that we are listening to words being spoken 20 years ago, and we're watching actions that happened even further dated, into apartheid, into the civil rights era in the US, and we are still seeing the disvaluement of Black and brown bodies across the globe. And it's really interesting, something that the New York City mayor said when the coronavirus really just hit New York at its height. He said that the coronavirus is the great equalizer. And people pushed back against it. I pushed back against it. And I was like, it is not an equalizer. It is, in fact, a highlighter and an unveiling, as Craig said, of the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And I love the term that Craig used in describing the apocalypse, because in my piece, I wrote about how my husband came home and said, the ICU wards in the public hospital that he works in Harlem looks like somebody had filmed an apocalyptic movie but had only cast Black and brown bodies in the role. And so it's really interesting. He came home and he was like, he's an African-American man. And like he said, there are only Black and poor people in this hospital struggling and not having access. And so I was doubly caught by the violence that we were seeing on the streets, and then also the violence that we see because of poverty and race and class and gender and all these intersectionalities that Gugu talks about the climate injustice, the fact that all these intersectionalities just converged. And I think for us, the corona virus, the COVID has really not been the equalizer, but it is the highlight and the unveiling of this disparity that is so stark. And so I question, what do we listen to the protests and we listen to these young people who are leading us in the protests these days. And the question in the US, they're not like South Africans. They don't toy down the street. And so they have little chants. And one of the big chants the question is asked, what do we want? And then the answer to that call is justice. And then the question then is, when do we want it? And we want it now. And so my question is, I quoted Dr. Cornel West, in my piece, when he says that justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. And so I think it's really, really interesting that we have to consider, like, who gets to have this love? Who is our brethren? If you are religious or if you are humanistic, you think about all the great religions of the world. They have love at the center, right? And so how does this love actually manifest itself in our lives? It's truly a question that is individualistic, and it really sits with us because we cannot exist without a just and equitable world. And so love cannot exist in a world that it is not just and equitable, where we see each other as equals and deserving of the same lives and accesses to us. And so it simply cannot. And thus we have to, on a very global scale, this movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, has seen us, pushed into impetus and movement, and especially within this global pandemic as the backdrop, we have to tip the scales. And I'm always just, brought back to where I come from and who I am and who I want to emulate. And for me, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu always told us, and I'm paraphrasing him, that if we are complacent in times of strife and struggle, we have chosen the side of the oppressor. And so that for me is really, really important. I've taught my children that. So we have to move, we have to be in action. And I'm really just grateful to be in this room with so many like-minded people, so that we can continue to do the work that we are doing. It is necessary and it is important. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for your heartfelt piece. And yes, the disproportionate effects of this pandemic, it's becoming clear. And as the US leads in both infections and deaths, it cannot be more visible to us what's happening. I now call on Lorenzo Davids, who is the CEO of Community Chest, to talk to us about his piece, which is called The Call to a Comprehensive, Inconvenient and Costly Justice. Lorenzo, please talk to us.
Thank you, Senari, and thank you, Stan, for the invitation. My piece focuses on whether the whole notion of a social justice has been subverted and undermined in the both national and, I suppose, global narrative. Has social justice become an escape for racists to practice feeding homeless people and looking after women and building shelters and funding enterprises that do socially good whilst maintaining a racist and oppressive narrative, all under the guise of social justice? And whether we have allowed that cohort of investors and activists to subvert the call for justice. And so, the term social justice was first used in around 1840 with the Industrial Revolution, and then the resurgent movement in Italy to raise the plight of those who suffered under those systems that emerged on both parts of the world. And I question whether today the term social justice is still a relevant term, and whether we should not say it as it is. This is a call for justice, comprehensively, inconveniently, and in its fullest term, in its fullest measure. So we are probing and trying to understand how people can call for social justice, but not talk about the impact of injustice everywhere. And so they're happy to build a shelter or feed homeless people or look after children and go and see a facility that cares for pregnant teenagers, whilst at the same time funding and participating in a narrative that is oppressive. And that we either rescue that term social justice from the hands of those who oppress us, or we cancel it and say, no, we will only talk about the full extent of justice, what justice looks like in its fullest extent, because of the subversion that we've found in the term, or of those using the term social justice. So that's the focus of my piece, and that's the inconvenient conversation that I think we should have when we participate in these dialogues. When people say this is a dialogue about social justice, then we say, how can you talk about the homeless and not talk about housing? How can you talk about women and not talk about equity? How can you talk about people from other countries and not delve deep into the effects of xenophobia? How can you not talk about homophobia and yet you talk about a God that is loving and just and caring about all human beings? And so that's where I zero in on, that we must ask those who speak on social justice whether they embrace an inconvenient and caring and deep justice narrative, and not just about the social justice issues that they particularly like to get involved with. Thank you, Zanaria.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Reinforcing the point of intersectionality, which has been raised by many of the other contributors. We cannot sort of departmentalize or compartmentalize any of these issues. They all intersect, and we need to look at them as a whole. I now have our final contributor in terms of authors to address us. It's Kumi Naidoo, who is the first global ambassador for Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And his piece is entitled Affluenza is an Injustice. Kumi, please talk to us about your piece.
Thank you, Zanaria. Greetings, everybody. I must start by saying that I'm reminded of a moment during the liberation struggle. If you followed such excellent presentations that we've just heard, you started by saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speakers. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and you spoke for about 1 hour. But given that I have to, let me just thank Community Chess, what I consider to be one of the most precious assets formed by the South African people to support the poor and most needy, for bringing us together. My piece comes from a bigger piece that I wrote called COVID is Horrific, but Affluenza is the biggest threat facing humanity. And affluenza is basically a pathological illness that has affected the vast majority of humanity, where we've been led to believe that a good, decent, meaningful life comes from more and more material acquisitions. But it breeds conspicuous, meaningless consumption on the one hand, but most importantly, it breeds high levels of stratification. So much so that today most of our political leaders, even though they might have come from humble working class backgrounds, live a life that they have to guess what the day-to-day reality of what a price of liter of milk costs, what a price loaf of bread costs, and so on. So this huge gap in this coronavirus moments means for those of us who have hungered for justice and have fought for justice for all our lives, we have to now stop and say that we cannot have the return that we had after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, when everybody was saying, even the most powerful political and economic players were saying that we cannot go back to normal. But what happened? Basically, it was system recovery, system maintenance, and system protection once the position allowed. Whereas what we needed then and what we need now is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. We cannot be comfortable with the idea that the sum of our efforts, right, is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity is sinking, literally and figuratively. We cannot be content any longer to only treat the obvious manifestations of injustice, but not treat the root causes. That is not to say that we can abandon the people who are the victims of poverty and injustice. We need to pull them back from the cliff of despair, but we got to, because if we don't do it, who else is going to do it well? If the people who work with homeless people, if the people who work with women who are survivors of domestic violence, if the people who work with young people who are suffering from drug abuse, if we don't take that policy knowledge and force it into the policy discussions much more powerfully, we will continue to get reasonably okay policies, but those reasonably okay policies will never be implemented because the policymakers didn't really understand the nuts and bolts of how to implement. So I just want to end with saying that when we talk about justice, we have to recognize that justice is never achieved if, firstly, there is not a full and wholesome acknowledgement that injustice has happened, that for justice to be served, those that perpetrated the justice must offer a full, heartfelt, wholesome apology, and thereafter there needs to be reparations. So therefore, I want to conclude, and you won't be surprised, I'm still an activist at ART, with an action point, and that is the Pan-African Social Movement, Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, is launching a campaign to get all the former colonial powers to do those three things: acknowledge, apologize, and explore reparations. And we're starting with the British Queen, and the petition is on the change.org website. The second petition, where you type Africans Rising, and you'll get to it. And if my technological incompetence doesn't let me down, I've just pasted the link there. So with those words, let me just end by saying Martin Luther King said in 1965 at the end of his speech, he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note that in the field of psychology, there's a very dominant word called maladjusted. Now, we all want to be well-adjusted and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in the world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to." He goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, or economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty." So I invite you, dear brothers and sisters, to take the challenge of Martin Luther King when he said, "I call for a new movement to be set up, an International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Let's be proud of not supporting the status quo. Let's be proud to be creatively maladjusted to injustice. And let us say that small changes will not get us from where we are. We need big structural systemic changes if justice is to be achieved for South Africa, the African people, and the people of the world as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kumi, for that powerful piece. And yes, we refuse to be well adjusted. I think that's becoming clear from all the contributions that have been made and by your piece. Kumi is going to take us out later with a poem, which is a video of a poem he's written. And for those of you who will engage with our book publication, you will see it is in our publication as well. But for now, I'm going to call on my co-editor and National Director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Stanley Henkeman, to just give us a summation of what's happened here, and very briefly before we end today's launch of this publication. Thank you, Stanley.
Thank you, Zenaria. Let me just say that it is impossible to do justice to these wonderful contributions. I mean, each one of them could have been a seminar, a webinar on its own. So I just want to acknowledge that they've done an amazing job. And initially, I was going to say something about each presentation, but that's going to take too long. But what our authors have highlighted today is first and foremost that we're sitting in a world that is in crisis. And the fact that they have approached this conversation from different angles, each one of those articles talk about the crisis, one form or another of the crisis. And I think it's worth looking at each one of them, you know, and when one reads the publication, you'll see how well it is articulated, and you've heard it from the authors themselves in their own words. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I pick up from our authors is also the fact that they are deeply concerned about the crisis, and particularly the crisis that each one of them highlight. And what I find very, very useful is that they all challenge, they are concerned about the distorted realities that we find us, you know, basic income, whether it's about racism, but all of them talk about the fact that we live in a society where the realities get distorted, and the realities are shaped by those who are powerful, those who control the narratives, and I see that concern coming through very, very, very strongly. But also what I see is a concern about the disproportionate attention that each of these topics get. And I think the important aspect there is to just understand that and Kumi, you put it so powerfully at the end, that we need to get to a point where we say it shouldn't just be a concern. It should be much more than that. And in very interesting, you know, concept of violence coming through in more than one presentation, and you know, both physical but also each is these public contributed. And this is the kind of violence that gets compounded. You know, the less we do about it, the more compounded it becomes. So I hear those concerns very, very strongly through all the presentations. But what I also hear very strongly from all of you, from all of the participants, the panelists, is that we can't just sit and do nothing. Strong call to action. Again, Kumi, it is very appropriate that you made a very strong call at the end. And you know, and it's about this publication is about having the inconvenient conversations. So I hear the call for dialogue, but not dialogue for the sake of dialogue, but dialogue about what we want. Nosal, you kind of reflected that the slogan for us, you know, what do we want? When do we want it? And it's a very direct way of articulating not what we would like, but what we want. And that kind of forthrightness and assertiveness is something that I pick up, that it must not be dialogue for the sake of dialogue. We want to have a dialogue about our liberation. We don't want to have a dialogue about whether it's appropriate. It is a dialogue about our freedom, about the end of whatever it is we have identified. There needs to be a shift in the narratives, and all of you have kind of given us a sense of what the status quo is, but what I also pick up in all the contributions is, so here's the alternative. Let's shift the narrative. And when you shift the narrative, you make those who have owned the narrative up till now uncomfortable. And that's where the inconvenient conversation comes in. And Craig and Renee, your article has also highlighted that very strongly. But this call to action is also about transforming structures, transforming mindsets, transforming people's realities. And that's what also comes through very clearly. What didn't make it in the publication is a quote, which I'd like to read now. And Kumi, apologies, I'm also redoing a Martin Luther King quote, but this is what he said. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when you must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but we must take it because it is right. And when we do that, we have to, Ignatius, ask ourselves, so what does this new reality look like? And let me end with a quote from Audre Lorde, who said that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. We need to have our own tools. And this conversation is a beginning of finding those new tools. Thank you to all the authors, and thank you for an amazing publication. Over to you, Zanere.
Thank you very much, Stan, who, as I indicated, was the co-editor. As the executive director of IJR, I thank you for your participation and your summation. As difficult as it was, you did an excellent job of just summarizing what our contributing authors have done here. So I just want to thank everyone who has joined us for this virtual book launch, publication launch. We will place it into the chat. It will also be provided to everybody who joined today. It will be sent to you. But I want to thank all of you. Peter Tosh, Ignatius spoke about common earlier. Peter Tosh saying, everyone is crying out for peace. None is crying out for justice. But I think with the contributions today, it's very clear that all our contributors and the organizations they represent have issued a clarion call for justice. And there is some information in the chat. And of course, one can engage with all of these contributors, or at least the organizations, once you receive the publications. I want to thank all of you for what you've done here in a short period of time. Thank you very much. And to my co-host Stan, and then also to you as an audience, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to play out with a poem by Kumi, but we're going to do it a video, and there's some very powerful images on that video which may upset you if you're a little sensitive. I'm hoping that you have the stomach to actually watch it. The struggle for justice is not for the faint-hearted. So the poem is called What Have We Done? And I'll ask my colleague Tamar to place that into the, to play it out for us. Thank you very much, everyone. This will end our day today.
This poem is dedicated to all those who fight for racial justice around the world and is offered as a gesture of solidarity by the Pan-African social movement, Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. What have we done? Yet another mother's son, taken from us on the day of African liberation, a day that should have been a celebration, will now be etched in memory as a day of total sadness and treachery. George Floyd died because of hate, a prejudice so ingrained and innate that it is as normal as blinking, so we open our mouths without even thinking of our words and the implications when we should stand as one global nation. For justice and equality and for all humanity, irrespective of color, yellow, white, black or brown, so that no other black person is ever beaten down. All lives matter. Some might want us to say. All right, okay, but answer me this. When we say, save our whales, rhinos or trees, do we mean down with all the other species? No, we simply mean let's keep perspective. And in times of real threat, let's be more introspective. Is your life a constant test of survival and right to be, with no end to racial injustice, no police brutality? You see, in our world, whiteness trumps the right to live. It's a benchmark for who loses and wins. It's so endemic, a sickness, a pandemic, that creeps in and takes hold and leads us to believe all that we are told. That damaged property matters more than lives lost, and that privileged interests must be preserved at all cost. The reality is that class and race go hand in hand. So if you are poor and black, your life is surely damned. Perhaps think of George Floyd whenever you feel oppressed, unaired, or have a raw deal. He died pressed against the floor, not pleading for anything more than his mama and air to breathe and the natural right to be free. So I ask again, do all lives matter right now? Especially when it's primarily a problem if you're black or brown?
Thank you. We will end this launch today after watching this amazing video. And I'm sure you're all as moved as I am. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Be safe, be well, and please engage with the publication, which will be sent to you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Zinni. Great work.
Thank you. Very well done. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye all. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you, Zanaria.
Goodbye.